Hello, everyone. So yeah, as he was saying, my name is Osama Dorias. I'm a game designer at Warner Brothers in Montreal. I've been in the industry for about 10 years. This is what I look like in sim form. This is what I look like in not sim form. So Warner Brothers now, but I'm the coordinator of the video game programs at Dawson College. I co-authored the independent game design program at Dawson. I used to be a teacher in the program, no longer have time, because I'm also the coordinator, I'm also the co-founder of the Montreal Independent Games Festival, and I have my own little hobbyist company called Magic Pants, where we've made one game and working on another. So yeah, I keep busy. These are some of the games that I worked on. I've actually shipped about 30 games in my over 10 years in the industry of varying sizes. The biggest game I worked on is For Honor at Ubisoft, but also my Heroes Never Lose, the one all the way at the end. This one is the indie game that I released, and others, with different companies. Like I worked at Ubisoft, I worked at Gameloft, I worked at Minority Media, which is an indie studio, and I worked at GE, where we made games for airplanes, if that makes sense. The annoying ones where you hit on the seat of the person in front of you. I made a couple of games for that. So what is this talk about? I want to be clear about something. This talk isn't about basically necessarily games specifically. It's about media in general. The reason for this is that there aren't a lot of representations of Muslims in video games, so I had to look elsewhere. It's still a how-to guide, so I could use references from movies or comics to show best practices. So if you're here just for the game side, but there's a big overlap in entertainment, so I hope you don't mind that a lot of my examples are going to be drawn from other media. This is an explanation of, to start, I'm going to start with an explanation of why positive representation is important, very briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. And the second is, it's a brief explanation of what Islam is and isn't. And this could be a long lecture that would span many days or months or weeks. So I'm going to keep it very brief and try to maybe touch on a couple of things that hopefully not a lot of you know about. And the end part of the talk, which is the biggest part of the talk, is the how-to guide, step-by-steps of if you want to represent Muslims in games, and I hope you do, there are general guidelines. Now keep in mind that this is a very subjective topic, and if another Muslim tells you otherwise about one or two of the points, they are also right. It's not a question of who's right or who's wrong. Feel free to talk to people who are within your circle of Muslims if you want to represent Muslims as well. Or if you want, reach out to me. Ali has my contact, so does Kay, and they'll share it with you, and I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. And I assume there's a QA at the end where you can ask? Okay, so we'll do that as well. So what is this talk not about? It's not about convincing the audience that not all Muslims are bad. I hope at this point, if you've shown up, this is not a thing I need to convince you of. If so, we can go for a coffee later and, I'll answer any questions you might have in that regard, but hopefully you won't have to. And it's not about shaming people or companies who have misrepresented Muslims in the past. The truth is, I've worked on games that have misrepresented Muslims. That is a reality of our industry. That's part of why I'm giving these talks. I've tried to fight it from the inside, and I was successful to varying degrees. It got better over time as, just society became more open to that kind of discourse. But that's the reality of it. And I know that even the people who made the decision to apply didn't necessarily have bad intentions. They just didn't know better. And it took a while before I was able to convince them that, there are better ways to do things. So it's not about shaming anyone, the high or the low. It's just about doing better. That's all. So let's get into it. Why is this important? Why is representing Muslims important? The main reason is that Islamophobia is on the rise. And this is not a thing I have to convince you of, I hope, but I'm going to show you some stats anyway. Most cases of Islamophobia happen on the street, but a lot of them happen in mosques and in workplaces and schools. Assalamu alaikum. It's Muslim Standard Time. Get used to it. I can say that. It's okay. Most of the victims, unfortunately, are women. Most of the perpetrators are men. And 10% of the cases are of extreme violence. This is the reality of Islamophobia. I mean, it peaked at 9/11, it went back down, and now with, some changes in the political climate, it's starting to go up again. And because of this, 15% of North American Muslim children hide their faith. That's a devastating number. And many of them can't, because a lot of what Islam is linked to our culture and our ethnicity, and a lot of them is linked to how we dress and how we speak. So sometimes we can't. But even the ones who can, 15% of them hiding it, it's staggering. So I could share the resources for this, but I mean, you'll have no hard time finding proof that Islamophobia is on the rise on the internet. So the basic, what this boils down to is that Muslims have a public image problem. And it's actually dangerous for us to be Muslim in many cases. Not always, but in many cases. Now, I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story. That is a ham sandwich. When I was really young, I went over to a friend's house, one of my best friends, and I love his mom. She's like my second mom. And this was early when I had just befriended him. It was later on that I established, a stronger rapport. And so she made her son and me a ham sandwich. I didn't know her well enough to know how much I could open up to her. And the truth is, I could tell that it was only in good intentions. Of course, I was never in doubt. And I was too shy to explain that this is not a thing I eat and to ask for something else. So I didn't eat the sandwich. I said I wasn't hungry, and I waited until I got home, and I ate something else. It's not a big deal, of course. I mean, at the time, I realized that it was not, it was a kind of a no-fault situation. So I'm approaching misrepresentation in video games of Muslims as a ham sandwich. So everyone who tries to put Muslims in games doesn't realize necessarily, they don't have necessarily bad intentions. And I'm hoping to give this how-to guide so that instead we'll get like a tuna sandwich or something else out of it, right? So this is the story. And as I mentioned before, during this political climate in the elections of 2016, things got a little bit worse for Muslims. There were a lot of politicians who had good intentions, but who said some pretty bad things. Muslims caught on to these bad things. Other people, maybe to varying degrees, might have or might not have, and it's no fault of your own. It's not your experience. Of course, I'm not talking about this gentleman, because everything he says is poop. But I am talking about people who should have known better, and who otherwise said very positive things. So I'm going to take a minute to read it to you. I hope that you don't mind. Well, it's really small, so I'm going to lean it. If we are to succeed in defeating terrorism, we must enlist Muslim communities as some of our strongest allies, rather than push them away through suspicion and hate. So enlist and allies. We need to be cooperating with Muslim nations and with the American Muslim community. They're on the front lines. They can provide information to us that we might not get anywhere else. I've been Muslim all my life. I've never met a terrorist. I'm not on any front lines. I don't know where to go to find one. I'm glad I don't know where to go to find one either. So how can I be your ally in hunting them down? And every time a Muslim hears something like this, they say, but what are you talking about? This is a tweet that went viral by a young chap called Cash Ali. I'm pretty sure that's not his real name. I don't understand why non-Muslims think we British Muslims can stop ISIS. Mate, I can't even get a text back from the girl I like, and you expect me to stop a terrorist organization? For better or worse, this is the kind of stuff most Muslims are dealing with, right? To varying degrees of, religiosity. So what I'm trying to get out of this is, you don't need us to be your allies. We need you to be ours. That's the truth of it. This is a movie that came out in the 90s called Three Kings. Is anyone familiar with it? Yeah, a little bit of a synopsis. It follows three soldiers in the Iraq War, in the Desert War in Iraq. It's pretty typical patriotic movie where the Americans are the good guys and Muslims are the bad guys in this. Well, one thing that did stand out in this movie, it wasn't unique, but it wasn't something that was wasn't a trope that was used in a lot of different movies, It's that Muslims were portrayed also as the victims. So the Americans in this case were there to be the heroes to save Muslims, which is not all that common. You'd think it was more common, but usually Muslims are framed only negatively. But in this case, they were actually framed as victims, positively, I suppose. This is a scene, I'm sorry, the scene is it portrays a little bit of violence, so if you're sensitive to that, you could divert your eyes. It's not that bad, but still. So in this scene, and I'm not going to show you the video, don't worry, but this Iraqi woman was shot point blank in the head, and with cue the dramatic music, and it was actually a very emotional scene, all things aside. The issue with this is that the reason that this scene was in the movie was clear. It's to justify the Americans being there in the first place. The issue with that is when you're saying that we have to, well, and this justified actually the murder of other Muslims, of course, as revenge. So when you're saying that we must go to a foreign land to kill Muslims, that kill Muslims, what happens when Muslims die? That's what you're there for. And it cheapens our lives. It's not exactly wrong either, because 97% of the victims of terrorism are Muslim. It's the framing that's problematic. It's when you're only showing Muslims as victims and not as the people fighting against the terrorists. And that's actually the reality. Every country you go to that has terrorism, the vast majority of Muslims are fighting the terrorists and are the victims. But when you don't portray that other side of it, when you only portray them as the victims, you're painting a wrong image and you're justifying wars in our countries. So, solely portraying Muslims as victims justifies wars that make us victims. This is another movie, completely different example. It's called The Siege, also from the 90s. Yep, I'm older than you. It's okay, I've watched movies you haven't watched. Anyone seen The Siege? Good, it's a horrible movie. So in The Siege, it depicts a terrorist attack in New York. And of course, the perpetrators are Muslim. And there's one thing that stood out that was kind of unique. There was one character, Frank Haddad, who was a CIA agent, but he was also Muslim. The thing is about Frank is he's portrayed as the good guy. He was the good Muslim of the movie. And he was the one who drank and who participated in a lot of things that culturally or religiously are not appropriate to Muslims. And that's not an issue because, Muslims can choose their own level of religiosity. The issue is that all the bad guys were extremely religious and the one good guy was extremely on the other side. And that is the issue. Let people choose their own level of religiosity. Don't try to impose these doctrines on us. Because otherwise what you're saying is you can be Muslim, but you can't be too Muslim. That's problematic. And actually there's a lot of studies shown that actually terrorists were people who didn't study their religion for a long time, and that's why they were susceptible to become terrorists. Like we're talking specifically about Muslim terrorists, that there are a lot of articles, a lot of journalists who infiltrated them or who just interviewed them and realized that they actually had very little knowledge about their religion and often didn't practice very much. So this is, for people who like diagrams, that's a diagram. It makes it more official. So some Muslims practice more than others, and that's okay. Let them choose their own level of engagement with their religion. So now I'm getting to the point where I'm going to debunk a couple of misconceptions. Again, this could be a topic in and of itself, so I chose a few things that I found interesting. The first thing is, this is where most Muslims live. Of course, there are Muslims who live everywhere, and we're proof of that, right? But this is where most Muslims are concentrated. This is where Arabs are concentrated. And Arabs only account for approximately 15% of the Muslim population. Not all Arabs are Muslims. Not all Muslims are Arabs. There's a huge distinction between the two. So we have to be clear of that because often when you see Muslim, it's only Arabs that are put front and center, and that doesn't help either community. And there's a big Venn diagram of overlap, agreed, but it's not the same thing. The biggest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, a country you never hear anything about, probably because they don't have oil. There are never any wars there. It's extremely peaceful. Things are going well in the biggest Muslim country in the world. Shocking. One of the largest Muslim populations after Indonesia is actually in India, where the Muslims are a minority. And it's probably the second biggest country. Their censuses aren't all that accurate, so it's hard to tell. But it's probably the second biggest Muslim country that isn't actually Muslim in the world. And they account for actually almost as much as the Arab Muslims, just the Muslims in India. And if you take the whole Southeast Asia, the Muslim population are the majority of the Muslims in the world. So this hopefully debunked a couple of misconceptions, and you realize now that Muslims are not who necessarily you think they are. But yeah, this topic, we can go on forever. So now that I've done this, the next question is going to be much easier. What do Muslims look like? Gonna give it a second. Okay, before you answer that, because yes, I will ask you, I'm gonna ask another question. What does a Christian look like? What does an atheist look like? What does a vegan look like? So when I said, what does a Muslim look like, you most likely conjured up an image in your minds. When I said, what does a Christian look like, it was much harder to conjure up an image. Atheist probably didn't have an image at all, and vegan, you laughed. It's normal. So why is it? It's a very simple answer. It's because of stereotypes. You have a much wider pool of people to pick from when it comes to Christians and atheists, so it's harder to narrow it down to one look. But you only see Muslims portrayed in specific ways, generally. So your stereotypes are more focused. That's normal. When you go to other countries, your stereotype might change because that's what it is. Stereotypes are not global; they're cultural and specific. But most of you probably conjured up an image similar to this, with varying degrees of undress on both sides, right? Well, as we mentioned before, this representation accounts for much less than 15%. This is like a minority within a minority within a minority. Now, if you've traveled the world and know better, you might have pictured something along this spectrum of color. And you'd probably be a little bit closer to the truth. But really, the spectrum is much wider because Muslims can also look like this. Muslims exist on all different axes. Like who? Like everyone else. Like the Christians, like the atheists, even the vegans. They don't have a specific look. Sometimes they have elements that are associated to either their culture or their religion from the geopolitical area that they're from, and that's normal. But there's no universal look for Muslims, not even close. So, with that in mind, I'm a game designer, so let's play a game. I call this game 50 Shades of Brown. So I need you to answer really quickly. So I'm going to put up an image, and if you think this image represents a Muslim, put up your hand really quick. Don't overthink it. And don't be scared, because I get a lot of people, thank you, I like it. I like that energy. Bring that energy. All right. Good. Wait, did you put up your hand? No, it's okay. I'm not judging anyone. Now nobody's going to put up their hands. I know how this plays out. Sikh. You're not entirely wrong, but Hindu. Everyone's scared. I know it. I saw a lot of people go like this. It's okay. Christian, Syrian Christian, Arab Christian. Oh, you noticed. Ethiopian Jew. Buddhist. But if you raised your hand for almost any of these, you would not have been far from the truth. Because all of these people come from countries with large populations of Muslims, and really their dress differs in what Muslims wear in details. So if you're quick to raise your hand, it's not a problem, because Muslims wear turbans and they wear saris. And really, they dress exactly like the Christian Syrian. Like Syrian Muslims and Christian Syrians wear the same clothes. It's cultural. It doesn't matter. Same thing for the Ethiopians. And even Buddhists. In countries that have large populations of Muslims and Buddhists, you can barely tell them apart, if any at all. So it's totally okay if you failed at this. It proves my point. Was that a fun game? I'm a good game designer, right? So Muslims are diverse, not unlike non-Muslims. Now I get to the meat of the talk, the how-to guide. I'd like to start with one of the best examples of recent history or memory or eternity of a Muslim depiction of a character. This is Kamala Khan. Does anyone know who she is? Kamala Khan is Miss Marvel. She is a Muslim character of Pakistani descent who runs in Marvel, Marvel comics, with Iron Man and Thor, the same run. She's actually one of the later characters to take on the mantle of Miss Marvel. She was created by two Muslims, G. Willow Wilson, a Muslim convert, and Sana Amanat. Now, what's amazing about Kamala Khan, from a person who just gave away a lot of comics on Facebook, as Ali can attest to, who has a huge collection and is really into all this media, she's the first character that I could actually say that depicted my experience growing up as a Muslim in the West, which is shocking because she's a woman and Pakistani descent, two things I'm not. But still, and why is that? Why is it that it felt so authentic, so real? And it's not the only attempt. There were other Muslim characters that were in comic books. There were other Muslim characters that were in a lot of other different mediums. But why is this one specifically different? It's because the authors were telling their experience. And people who go through an experience can tell. It's that simple. Now, what's interesting about this is when they signed up to write this and to create this comic, they only had a story for the first 3 issues because they didn't expect it to do well. This is a test, an experiment. And the comic is still going well. Like, it's actually exceeding sales. From the runs that started at the same time, it's the only survivor. It's the only one that's still running. I think it's been going on for 4 or 5 years. Don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. But it's been years and have volumes. And it's the only one. And the reason for that is because Muslims are starved for this kind of representation. We don't get it anywhere else. So my point for this is, if you have a platform, give it to us. And at least for now, while the climate is desperate for it, you will succeed. In the future, we'll see. Talk to us. So as I mentioned before, this is extremely subjective. And if another Muslim has a different opinion about another point, they are also right. So it's not about competition between us. This talk actually would have been better if it was a panel. But it's really hard to find Muslims in games who want to talk about this. So we'll see. Maybe one day it will become a panel. But yeah, there are a lot of different varying opinions. And the best ones to go for are the Muslims that are close to you for that reason, because they're close to you. You want to have that access. So if you have Muslims that are close to you and you want to represent a Muslim character in the game, maybe tell that Muslim story. Don't stack tokens. And what I mean by this is, if you have a game with a lot of different characters, don't make one the paraplegic black Muslim woman and say, check, 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 and then have everyone else in your game be a white guy. I mean, I'd love to hear the story of a black paraplegic Muslim woman. There's absolutely no problem with that. It's the opposite. That sounds like an incredibly interesting character, but you're not going to get bonus points for it. That's not how representation works. And if you do have a character that has a lot of different tokens stacked together, then try your best to find someone who lives to as close as that experience as possible as a consultant. You all know that whenever an actor has to play a part, they do a lot of research and they meet with people who play that part, or live that part. If you can't, then at least get 2 people who live the 2 or 3 different experiences together and listen to their conversation and have them discuss it. That's the bare minimum. So don't stack tokens. You're not doing anyone a favor. And we can feel it. Just like with Kamala Khan and her predecessors, actually. Just like how we are able to feel it, it's the same thing. The other thing is, if you have voiceovers, insist on authentic voiceovers. Now, I absolutely loved Aladdin growing up, mostly because I didn't know better. Also because there was no other equivalent that I could look at. So it was the best that I had. In retrospect, when I tried to show it to my kids, I was like, ugh, bad, no. And it was really, really hard to stomach. So one of the things that stood out the most is that the character barely looked like me. Didn't look like me at all. But get the idea? Like me, like us, and absolutely didn't sound like me. And that's a problem to varying degrees. But I mean, it's only better if the character sounds like the source material, or in this case, the people they're supposed to represent. An amazing example of this for people who play Overwatch is the voice actress for Anna Amari. She actually lives in Egypt. And if you're Egyptian, you can actually know what city that she's from. And as a side point, she's actually age appropriate for the character. And that's incredible, and that's so rare. So what ends up happening is if she says something, you know who's talking. You don't have to guess. It's incredible. It's out of this world. This is representation done right. So if you're going to put a character, insist, if possible, if your budget allows for it, if you like have a friend who speaks in that tongue or whatever, that's fine. But do it. If you have a roster, then add us to it. And represent our religion at the same level as you would represent the religion of anyone else on the roster. What do I mean by this? Does anyone play Street Fighter? Does anyone know who Hakan is? Is Hakan Muslim? I don't know. But it's okay that I don't know. He's Turkish. That's enough, because I don't know if any other of the characters are Christian or anything. So you don't have to make it a sticking point. Hey, I'm representing Muslims. Just representing our cultures is enough. It's a good start. You don't have to stick it in our faces. We'll appreciate it. Believe me, it'll go a long way. And there are many examples of other characters who we don't necessarily know if they're Muslims or not, and that's totally okay. This is Farida Malik. She's an NPC in Deus Ex. She's from Dearborn, Michigan, and it's clear, and she's Muslim in character. And she's actually a positive representation because she's a strong woman, and she does a lot of incredible things in the game. She's an important character. And her religion is a side point in this, except that when she speaks about it, she sees it as a positive. It's perfectly balanced, and it's amazing. They clearly did their research. If you have NPCs, add a Farida Malik. This is another example. Sarah Hasmadi. Has anyone played Tacoma? She's one of the characters in Tacoma. Same thing. It's clear that she's Muslim. It's not, but it's not pushed in your face. She's actually a very intelligent woman. She has, I think, 7 PhDs, or I'm making that up, but a big number of PhDs, and she drives the story. But her religion isn't a sticking point. It doesn't drive the plot, and that's okay. It's enough. If you're going to have an NPC, we want to appear normal because we're normal. So it's okay to just have us there and just say, oh, also they're Muslim. That's totally okay. It's more than okay. It's amazing. We'd love it. It doesn't have to be a driving factor. Actually, I don't have a slide for this, but has anyone watched Lost? Yeah. Do you know? Yeah, it's fine.
I was like 8.
It's okay. You don't have to. Don't go watch it on my account. That's fine. But Sayed, one of the characters on the show, well, he has a lot of other problems because he's also an Arab that's played by an Indian, but that's okay. There are a lot of other things that we could talk about. But one thing is that he was actually started off as an amazing positive character. He was just a normal guy doing his things. And then eventually they tacked on this backstory of violence. And now we have this association. Why can't we just have a Muslim character who doesn't have a backstory of violence? He wasn't a terrorist, but he was fighting terrorists. But still, we don't want that association. Most Muslims have nothing to do with that. Why can't we just get a normal Muslim? So that's what we want. We just want people who are people as much as possible. Let us tell as much as possible our stories of Muslims struggling with their faith or Muslims struggling to be in the West. We know that experience more than anyone else. We'll write the Kamala Khans. Please just help us be normal in your games. So, our rituals are precise. Has anyone seen Robin Hood? Old movie, but a goodie. And in this movie, we have a character Azim, who was played by Morgan Freeman. What's amazing about Azim is that he was actually a good representation of Muslims. He was not perfect. He was actually exiled from his country, and he has an ambiguous past, and he's kind of xenophobic, and he refers to people as Christian. But he has a strong moral code, which is his own moral code, which was interesting because he was a balanced character in some way, because you don't look at him and say, oh, perfect person, therefore perfect representation. No, he felt real, especially for someone at the time of the Crusades. It was a normal depiction. And I loved him until it got to the scene where he was depicted praying, and I didn't recognize what he was doing. Our rituals are precise. Like, I actually worked at Minority Media, where sister company was Resolution Pictures. It's mostly Native Americans who make documentaries, and that's one of their strongest sticking points, is that their dances and their rituals are very specific, but whenever they're portrayed by people other than them, it's just random mumbo jumbo. If you don't want to do the research, then just don't do it. It's easy. Azim could have been an amazing depiction of a Muslim at the time of the Crusade if it wasn't for that one sticking point. It's annoying, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I don't know what he was doing. It looked like a yoga dance, but it was fine. It looked beautiful, but it just wasn't it, right? And it's such a simple thing. They didn't know one Muslim that they could have said, hey, look at this. Does this look okay? It's not that hard to do. Or just cut it out. Like, we don't have to have it. So, in terms of character customization, this is Farah, also from Overwatch. Yes, I'm a big Overwatch fan and addict. So Farah had a recent, well, not just her, but she had a new skin where she was wearing a hijab in it. And this actually was a really powerful moment for me. But not just me. This is Jasmine Kills You, Twitter name. Actually, her actual Twitter is @JasmineLovesYou, so it's okay. I think this was during Halloween or something. And Jasmine Kills You says, Farah's wearing a hijab. I'm Muslim. You don't know how much this means to me. I've been waiting for this my whole life. As a Muslim male, I've been waiting for this my whole life. So I could only imagine how much she's been waiting for this. It's incredible. As soon as the skin came out, I insta-bought it, and I have not dressed Farah in any different way. And she became my main DPS. I'd like to think it had nothing to do with the hijab, but it probably did. Just saying. What's really interesting is if you look very closely at Jasmine Kills You's avatar on her Twitter, you see that it's a bloody but victorious Miss Marvel. We've gone full circle. So we're absorbing all of this new Islamic-friendly content, and we're loving it. So this is a path to success right here. And yeah, Muslims can love dogs too, so that's a stereotype. Just in case, have you ever heard anything wonky? We know Muslims that love dogs, it's fine. And non-Muslims that hate dogs, that exists too, just saying. So one thing that's interesting, I'm going to go back to Farah, is actually the depiction of the hijab is very accurate for an Egyptian. Her background is probably very complex. They say that she's probably half Native American from Canada as well, etc. And that's why she doesn't speak Arabic. And it's totally okay. That actually adds depth and richness to the character. It's not a comment on that. But because her half is from Egypt, it's cool and it's amazing that they depicted the hijab specifically from Bedouins who come from the region. Because there are many different forms of hijab. And they differ from country to country and have different names and they're portrayed in different ways. So if you're going to represent, as Overwatch did, a person from a specific country and you want to represent them in their cultural headdress or any other thing, then do your research. It's not that hard to do. And if you can find someone on the internet who comes from that country to double check it, it's not that hard as well. If you're a big AAA company, you have the budget to get a consultant. I'm talking if you're like small indie, you can find somebody to just double check things on. And then at least you've tried. And even if you failed, no big deal. You tried. That's important. No one's going to get mad at you. Don't worry about it. But this is only if you're depicting somebody from a specific place. If you just want to add customization options, then go crazy. Because it doesn't matter at this point. Well, if we like it, we'll wear it. And if we don't like it, we won't wear it. And it's totally okay. But to have the option is what's important. So if you want to have a hijab with a beanie on top that spins, go for it. Is that a problem? We're going to love it. I'm going to wear that. It's going to be out of this world. So just have fun with it. So it only becomes sensitive when you link it to a culture or a place, and that's normal and understandable. Otherwise, it's a customization option. It's just a piece of fabric, right? Now, who can tell me where this is? This is a level from a popular game that I will not mention. What country does this represent? This is, wait, my text is gone. Oh, there it is, Arabistan. So what is Arabistan? It's war-torn place in some far-off Middle Earth country or whatever. Not Middle East / Southeast Asia. But that's Arabistan. I mean, Arabistan is a place that if you want to shoot your friends and the bullet goes astray, you won't feel bad because everything is rubble anyway. The issue with Arabistan is that when we have actual scenes of real war, this is Syria before and after the recent war, it completely desensitizes people. People don't recognize the first picture of Syria. They only recognize the second one because they've played there. They've shot their friends there. And that's an issue. Positive representation of these countries where Muslims come from don't exist, or rather barely exist. And that's actually my next point. This is my friend Nicolas Barrière, who's also a game designer from Montreal. And I'm a huge fan of Overwatch, but I missed the announcement of this. I probably was crunching or something on a game, I don't know. But he, basically his tweet went viral. He wrote, Overwatch's new map, Oasis, is set in Iraq. Good to see visions of future that glorify Muslim East. Sorry, let me say that again. Good to see visions of future that glorify the Middle East instead of the usual depictions. What's interesting, if you don't know about Overwatch, it's actually set in the future. And in this depiction, Iraq was rebuilt. It's actually a hub of technology. It went back to its old roots of Babylon, where, the cradle of civilization, and it's glorious once again. So he showed this to me. He just told this to my Iraqi-Canadian friend, colleague, and game design mentor, and he legit choked up. I couldn't hold back. So yeah, this is me, in case you needed proof. See, that's my name right there. And I'm a person who thinks about this all the time, about representation. I mean, I've been fighting it from the gaming industry, from the inside, since I started in the industry. And then half the conversations with people, I think I bore people to death because I'm always slipping it in whenever someone says a remark that's inappropriate or anything along those lines. And to my shame, I've never projected a positive future from my country of birth. Yes, I'm from Iraq. I'm actually born in Iraq. And I moved here maybe when I was 7 years old. So of course, when someone shows me a positive representation, I'm going to get emotional. And that's what Overwatch did to me. So I'm using this as proof that representation matters. It's actually important. We need you to amplify our voices, and we need you to include us. And this is a screenshot from The Sims. Does anyone know The Sims? You must know The Sims. Yeah, so The Sims has been making amazing strides for diversity and representation. And recently they've had a content patch that allowed Muslim women to be represented. And this is really important. What we're hoping for is to have this kind of treatment across all games, or as many as possible. Positive or neutral representation of Muslims is important because diversity is beautiful. Thank you.